All of my acrylic paintings begin basically the same way, which is I work very thinly with paints in those beginning stages. That beginning stage is called the underpainting. I'm really just working in thin layers of local color to build up the painting slowly, layer after layer. I don't commit to a color for a section by laying it on very thickly, because then it's much harder to change later on. The other added benefit of working your painting up in thin layers is that you really do get a lot of exciting variation, texture, little interesting areas of color, just shapes and stuff like that happening throughout the painting. You can really give a lot of dynamic texture and depth and quality to your painting than if you just started working with opaque colors right away from the beginning. You see, I'm just dropping in a mixture of green and blue to build up the trunks of those trees a little bit more and locking those drips in place again with the blow dryer. And now I'm just taking some brown and yellow ochre paint for the bottom of the painting. I work with pretty large brushes at the beginning stages of my painting. As it goes along, and as I get more and more detailed and I work in smaller and smaller spaces on the painting, the brushes get smaller as well. But for those early stages, larger brushes is just fine. You can cover large areas, and again, you can kind of get fun and loose with the paint and not get so constrained yet with details. Don't get too concerned if your painting is a mess in the beginning stages, okay? It's supposed to be your time to explore and experiment and have fun and keep it loose. You'll have plenty of time to tighten up your painting in the later stages. So right here I have some of the most common brushes and tools that I use when I am painting. Here I have a 1.5 inch wash brush, and I use this for painting in large areas or backgrounds. That's pretty much the same thing I do with a 1 inch wash brush, but I can get a little bit more detailed, and it's a softer bristle than this brush. So it allows me to get more smoothing and to blend the paint better than this one. And if I want to do the ultimate blending, I use a mop brush with it, which is very, very soft. Feels really nice. I'm getting distracted. These are great for blending colors. This is also a wash brush, but it's a little bit different than this one. Yes, it's smaller, but they call this an oval wash brush because it's got the tapered edges that you see here. Really nice, and it gives you different kind of effects that you can do with this. These are really good and useful for painting, say, flower petals. Things like that allows you to get more chiseled shapes. I also use a filbert brush. These are very similar to the oval wash brushes in that they have a tapered edge, but they have a shorter bristle. Okay, so it allows for a little bit more detail. And for the ultimate detail work, I use spotter brushes. Spotters are very small, very few bristles on them, and lovely things for detail. All of these brushes that I use are synthetic, and none of them are real horse hair or hog's hair or anything like that. They're all synthetic brushes. They're very cheap. I don't rate a brush on its price. I rate a brush by, can it do what I need it to do? And it just turns out that the brushes I buy are rather inexpensive, but they actually do what I need them to do, which is great, and that's all I ask of my brushes. Of course, I also use, for different effects, I use toothbrushes. Old toothbrushes come in very, very handy for doing splatter effects and texture effects and creating star fields and all kinds of different things you can do with that. And Sylvia loves it when I use palette knives, because she says, you're not a real artist if you don't use palette knives. And so I use palette knives. This is an actual palette knife that's used for painting. And you can mix your paints with palette knives, and then you can apply the paints with them and do all kinds of fun things, carving into your paint or applying it thickly. This is actually a putty knife that I got from the hardware store, but I use it like a palette knife. So I use it for all the same things I would use this one for. So it's just wider, and it's a lot more sturdy than the palette knife. Palette knife has a bit of a bend to it, whereas the putty knife just doesn't bend as much. It's very strong, so it can take a lot of abuse.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Oh, yeah, what?
I don't say you're not an artist unless you use a palette knife. I just say that you really, really look like an artist when you use a palette knife.
Well, there you go. Okay. I stand corrected. I also use an airbrush. The airbrush that I use is an Iwata HPC airbrush. These can get quite expensive, so not everybody has airbrushes, and you can actually achieve a lot of the effects of an airbrush by hand with regular brushes by doing some intense blending, but it takes a lot longer, and it's just not quite as smooth as an airbrush is. So I love my airbrush. I take good care of it. It's a very useful tool, but you don't feel like you have to go out and get an airbrush to create acrylic paintings. It's not necessary. All right, so that's it. Those are the brushes and the tools that I use, and you'll see me use these all throughout the entire process of creating this painting. When you're washing your brushes, make sure that you wash them in cold water only. If you wash your brushes in hot or warm water, you may loosen the glue that holds the bristles in the brush, and then your bristles will fall out. It's also perfectly acceptable to wash your brushes with hand soap or dish soap. Just make sure that you thoroughly rinse it all out. After you're done cleaning the brush, make sure that you reshape the brush. Squeeze out any water that's in the bristles, but then reshape it into the original form that the brush was in. That way your bristles on the brush will remain nice and crisp and straight, and they won't be frayed. I always clean my airbrush after each use. If you let paint sit for too long in the airbrush, it will be difficult or impossible to completely clean it all out. Although you can use soap and water to clean your airbrush, I have found that airbrush cleaning solution works best. I first place a little solution in the gravity feed cup to clean it out as best I can. I then use a makeup sponge dipped in airbrush cleaning solution to gently clean the all-important nozzle and needle. Once I've cleaned it thoroughly, I will also spray warm water through the airbrush to remove any cleaning solution. If you plan to buy an airbrush, I highly suggest you also buy a spare needle and nozzle, as these are the two items that get the most wear and tear. Take good care of your airbrush, and it will last you a very long time. I continue working on my underpainting, just building up the paint a little bit more. It's just getting a little bit darker, but I'm still keeping the paint pretty thin. I'm not committing to anything yet by putting on, very thick, opaque paint. So I'm keeping it real transparent. And this is very common for me. I work this way on all my paintings, where I build up slowly and slowly and slowly, layer after layer after layer. It takes a lot of patience to work this way. You have to keep the bigger picture in mind. You have to remember where you're headed and try not to rush to get there, because each step along the way sets up the next step in the process. So if you try to skip a step, if you try to jump from doing this transparent stuff to right into working opaquely, can it be done? Sure. I mean, it depends on your style, but for my style, no, it couldn't be done that way, because the painting just wouldn't have the look. It wouldn't achieve the things that I want to achieve, which is that some parts of my painting ultimately end up remaining with the underpainting showing through, so that you can see lots of this texture while I've worked up the important parts of the painting. Using a paper towel to pick up paint can be really useful to catch drips and whatnot, but it can also be used to create different effects. And in the case of the sky I'm working on, it gives the impressions of clouds by removing some of that paint. Then I clean off my palette in preparation for the next step.